government shutdown, Obamacare's epic fail, the national debt, gridlock in Congress, Iranian nuclear ambitions, your government spying on you. All of these combined shrink in the shadow of what President Obama calls the defining challenge of our age. I'm PJTV's Scott Ott, joined now by Bill Whittle and Steve Green for part one of this tripartite trifecta. And men, that clear and present danger against which the president will marshal his plans is called income inequality. It's not that the rich are too rich or that the poor are too poor. It's the gap between them that makes the president soar. In fact, in a recent speech, Mr. Obama said he will spend the rest of his presidency reducing income inequality. Now, here's the tragedy of income inequality. If you're born at the bottom, in the bottom 20%, you have only a 5% chance of making it into the top 20%. But of those born up there in the, shall we call it the stratosphere lounge, 2/3 will stay up where the air is clear. And the top 10% grabs half the income, a chunk that's more than doubled since 1979. The odds are stacked against the little guy, and government policies keep it that way. Or as the president puts it, in endearing personal terms,
the idea that so many children are born into poverty in the wealthiest nation on earth is heartbreaking enough. But the idea that a child may never be able to escape that poverty because she lacks a decent education or health care or a community that views her future as their own, that should offend all of us. And it should compel us to action. We are a better country than this.
Now, Bill Whittle, on a pure narrative basis, in other words, I want you to forget about the substance and the validity of the case. I want you to evaluate the viability of income inequality as an issue for the president, based on your knowledge of history, American popular opinion, and the president's own ability to sell a story. What do you think?
Well, why don't we go to the history of dictators? That's a good place to start. History of dictators has always been an example of ginning up the masses against some perceived group that can be turned into your enemy. It's an internal enemy, can't be an external enemy. Those come later. There has to be an internal enemy, be the kulaks if they were in the Soviet Union, the independent farmers who had to be starved to death, 20 million of them, something like that, had to be starved to death to make way for our glorious socialist paradise. Of course, in Nazi Germany, National Socialist Germany, it was the Jews. And in Africa, it's either the Hutus or the Tutsis. It's somebody. It's always got to be somebody, because what the path to power is to gin up large masses of people against an enemy and ride that wave of emotion into control. And in a country where you have checks and balances against this kind of action, you have a very difficult task ahead of you. That's why it's taken him 5 years to build this constant case, if you're talking about the narrative. And that's why the primary problem with our country today is that the laws are not being enforced, that the Constitution is not being enforced, that the entire idea of the rule of law is being destroyed. I'll tell you something, Scotty. He didn't sound like he was on fire for me. I think his days are over. I think the headwinds have changed, and I think it's done for him. I don't buy it. He looks small. He looks weak, and we can dissect his argument later if you'd like.
It sounds like the summary is it can work, but this guy is not the one who's going to get it done. Earlier this month, the president actually trotted out a bundle of old ideas in a speech designed to address what he called the defining challenge of our age. In other words, he said, let's jack the minimum wage, jack spending on preschool, on technical training, and on college, and make more pro-union laws so that we can tilt the table away from management. Now, the New York Times actually blurted out what Obama concealed, which is that higher taxes on the rich are essential to closing the income gap. Steve Green, each of these initiatives on its own might be defeated on the merits, but taken as part of the dramatic, gripping, heart-rending tale of income inequality, wouldn't you agree that it's almost irresistible?
Yeah, like Chris Christopherson wrote in that famous song, "Freedom's just another word for nothing left to gain." Well, if spending legislation made people rich, we wouldn't be functionally broke. We are not the richest country in the world. We are functionally bankrupt. We are so deep in the hole. I don't know how we ever get out. But let me give you an alternate narrative. This is my iPhone. It hasn't made me any richer, but it's made my life richer. It's a great device by a great company. Steve Jobs, if he were alive today, if he were trying to do today what he did in the 70s, He never would have dropped out of college because he would have had this super cheap loan that he could have just, futzed around at school for 4 years on. He wouldn't have started a business in his parents' garage because the zoning laws are so restrictive now. He couldn't have hired people because he can't afford the Obamacare that he has to provide for them now. But this was not the situation when Steve Jobs was a young man, so he created this incredible company that creates these incredible products and creates all of these jobs for all of these people that causes incomes to rise. But today's Steve Jobs isn't doing these things because instead of starting a business in his parents' garage, he's stuck living in his parents' basement because he's broke. Get the government off our backs, please, because right now there's a Steve Jobs who's living in frustration and there's an Apple company that's not being created.
Well, a poor immigrant girl's eyes light up. She reaches for a penny on the filthy sidewalk. Just before her grubby fingers claim the prize, a black polished shoe comes down, blocking her reach. We get a glimpse of the Rolex as the man's hand snaps up the penny. The stunned girl looks up. Her eyes follow the faceless businessman as he whistles into the distance. My friend, this battle is won through the eyes and straight to the heart. Conservatives ignore this issue of income inequality at our peril. Worse, we ignore it at the peril of the greatest economic system that the world has ever seen. The hearts of hardworking Americans are already primed for this story that the president is weaving. They're already wondering why the few prosper on the backs of the many. In part 2 of this tripartite trifecta, we'll hear surprising words from Newt Gingrich and from the Pope. And in part 3, I'll challenge the trifecta team to tell a story that wins the hearts and minds before it's too late. For Bill Whittle, Stephen Green, and the entire trifecta crew at pjtv.com, I'm Scott Ott.